Man, I love Sonic Frontiers. If only the game was a game that When Sonic Frontiers first came out, one of the biggest disappointments in the game was the final boss. Some of my older viewers will recall that I already made a video talking about a rewrite for the finale of Sonic Frontiers, but this video isn't exactly about that. I'm instead going to be talking about the new boss fights that Update 3 will be adding, as well as the final boss of Update 3 as a whole. Obviously, this video will contain spoilers for Update 3, and I've talked about not wanting people to be spoiled without their consent. So this is your warning now. I will be spoiling basically everything about Update 3 in this video. So if you don't want to hear about it, leave. Alright, if you're still here, then anything you may miss out on while playing the game is no longer my responsibility. So for those of you who didn't watch this video, Update 3 is basically a full revamp of Oranos Island. I went over the full script of it already, but the short version is this. Tails, Knuckles, and Amy get revived by Sage and work with Sonic to defeat the End for good. While they're off working to slow the End down and get the Chaos Emerald, Sonic is going after a much more interesting goal. He's trying to connect with the 4 pilots of the Titans and gain their blessings. After Sonic receives each blessing, he's able to visit Master King, the leader of the Ancients, and gets a new form, Cyber Sonic. He then goes out to fight Supreme and the End. And other than the fact that Sage actually survives this time, it's pretty similar to the original ending, but clearly with a different boss fight. This raises a new question. The pilots act super aggressive towards Sonic when he first interacts with them, and only acts kind to him after he completes whatever trial they put him through. But what are the trials? Well, at first this was just wishful thinking, but after talking to people about it a bit more, the game and Sonic Team itself seem to go in a different direction, and I think there'll be boss fights. Meaning that we now have 6 new boss fights to look forward to. So with all that in mind, what will each of the boss fights entail? Well, we can't know for sure from the script. And while some data miners have found out some mechanics that bosses may have, they won't fucking tell me! It's almost like they don't trust me to give it out to the general public or something. So for now, we're left to guess. That's fine though. If the miners won't tell me, I'll figure it out myself. Yeah. Before we begin though, there's just one thing I want to instate. Instead of just referring to the pilots as pilots, I've actually given all of them names, and have had these in mind basically since the game came out. The pilot of Giganto is Licha, the pilot of Wyvern is Hercules, the pilot of Night is Theseus, and the pilot of Supreme is Perseus. There, feel free to use these, Sega, it would make my day. So let's get started with the battle against Licha. I'm gonna imagine each of the pilots have a similar fighting style to their Titans, but obviously smaller and a bit less climactic. Licha would likely use regular punches as her main attack, but I can also imagine her using something that was never really expanded upon in the Giganto fight, gravity manipulation. Giganto uses powers over gravity when she's first introduced, but never again. This is probably because those abilities wouldn't really have much of an effect on Super Sonic since he can fly. Normal Sonic is a completely different story though. I can imagine the first phase would mainly just be her punching at you and using the terrain to her advantage. Things sort of like the original boss fight against Chaos in Sonic Adventure, except harder and with more attacks. The second phase would then have Licha invert the gravity of the battlefield. Then you'd have to look out for a place to land so you don't fall into the sky, while also avoiding her attacks. Once gravity is reversed like this, Licha will take advantage of you by swinging around the platforms you're trying to stand on, potentially taking out more and more of them as the fight progresses. Because there's an added layer of difficulty with avoiding the death plane below, the player would not only need to be careful about how Licha attacks, but also how they attack, because using the wrong attack at the wrong time can basically mean death. I imagine a point near the end of the fight where there's one platform left, and Licha swings down at you, about to destroy it. At that point you would have to parry her out of the way and hit it, which would end the fight and bring gravity back to normal. Up next, Hercules. I can imagine Hercules acting both like Wyvern and Knuckles. Knuckles is obviously known for his heavy hits and overwhelming strength. Wyvern, on the other hand, is probably the fastest Titan except for maybe Supreme. Combine Wyvern's speed and Knuckles' strength and you get Hercules. I can imagine his first phase would revolve around him dashing around the arena while occasionally attempting to scratch at you heavily. The scratch would hurt as well, since it's one of the only attacks in the game that can only be avoided by a parry in the Titan fight. In addition to this, he would also occasionally slow down and call Sonic towards him, only to attempt to block his attacks himself with his sheer strength and push him back. The only way to avoid this would be to side-loop him twice in succession. Once you get him into his second phase, he begins using Wyvern's main mechanic, missiles. Lots and lots of missiles. In the transition, a bunch of missile launchers come out of the ground and begin spewing explosives everywhere. You have to avoid them as the fight goes on. In addition to this, Hercules will leave shockwaves wherever he lands, complicating the fight even more and forcing the player to find a space to land while also avoiding the missiles. The end of the fight would have a battle of strength between Sonic and Hercules, with Sonic physically having to break down all of Hercules' defenses. This would result in several button mashing QTEs where Sonic has to force Hercules' arms out of the way only to hit him repeatedly, with one punch in the face leaving him speechless and on the ground. Then we have Theseus, the pilot of night. Theseus would be the first character to fight with a weapon, using a sword and a shield to keep Sonic at bay. In addition to this though, I could imagine Theseus calling some of the Guardians to his aid in order to make the fight harder. Instead of using Squid like last time, it would be cool if he rode on Fortress. In the beginning of the fight, you would actually have to use one of the bird enemies to get close to him and jump onto the trail of Fortress. Fortress would then fly way faster and you would have to use the boost rails in order to catch up. Once you get onto Fortress, you'd have to get into the actual battle against Theseus. You'd have to parry his sword away and then hit him when his shield is no longer in front of him. If you try to hit him beforehand, he'll knock you off of the shield and you have to get back up to him again. In the second phase, Fortress ends up getting destroyed and you begin falling off the virtual Chaos Island with Theseus. You'll then have to go through a mechanic similar to the spider boss in order to reach him and hit him. As his health goes down more and more, the obstacles on screen increase more and more, to the point where the only way to reach him is by using the golden rings to get past walls of spikes. At the end of the fight, you have to dash towards him as fast as you can while avoiding spike balls and lasers that are chaotically spinning across the screen. Once you hit him, you're both transported back up to Chaos Island. Alright, the last of the pilots was definitely the one I had to get the most creative with. Perseus, the pilot of Supreme. The issue with this one is that the Supreme fight is almost immediately after this battle. While it's cool to have the pilot fights after their Titan fights, it doesn't really work well the other way around. So instead of modeling Perseus' fighting style from Supreme, I'm writing it based on Sonic. That's right, every move that you've learned across the game will be used against you. First off, Perseus himself has a homing attack, which you can only block by parrying. There will be a very small window of opportunity to stop him once he starts it, because he, like Sonic, is very fast. Perseus also has a parry of his own, meaning attacks like Sonic Boom or Cross Slash are out of the question entirely. For you, anyways. Perseus, on the other hand, is more than capable of firing several slices of energy at you as you desperately run in circles trying not to get hit. Enormous circles will also appear in the battlefield from time to time. After about a second of existing, a massive tornado will come out of them, and if you don't get out of the way, you're going to get sent into the skybox. In the second phase, Perseus begins using some of your stronger attacks. For example, he'll use the homing shot on you a total of 3 times in a row. You can try to parry it, but the attacks come in so fast it's nearly impossible to time correctly, and it's better to just dash away from. He'll also dash after you relentlessly, and won't let you go until one of you gets hit. The only way to damage him here is to jump over him, but that's pretty scary since he'll copy your every move. Once you're behind him though, you can hit him. Don't think you're safe there then. After you hit him, occasionally he'll use Sonic's recovery smash, and you'll have to either parry or dodge in order to avoid it. Once you drain his health bar completely, he stands completely still. He then starts twitching though. He looks up at you as this happens and then starts teleporting around the area maniacally. Suddenly, he begins teleporting around so fast it's like he's everywhere at once. Sonic will quickly have to avoid his attacks as he gets stuck in Perseus' Phantom Rush. Even if you do somehow manage to hit him, he'll just fall back and start teleporting around again. As this goes on, more and more purple mist comes out of his body. He slows down more and more, until Sonic is finally able to Psyloop him. Once the player Psyloops Perseus, he stops and stares straight down, just like Sonic did when he was overcome by cyber corruption. At this point, Sonic is prompted to share memory tokens with him. There won't be a requirement here, so it's mainly just for narrative purposes, but once Perseus is brought to his senses, the boss fight ends. But I know what you're really here for. The battles against the pilots are cool and all, but you want to hear about the fight against the end, don't you? Well, too bad, because we have to talk about Supreme first. The first phase of Supreme's boss fight would be kinda similar to the original fight, but way more intense and very different from Giganto. In addition to their normal attacks, Supreme would also have the lost QTEs. Every once in a while, Supreme will fire their gun at you over and over again as you dodge out of the way. That's only the tip of the iceberg, though. Supreme will also jump around the island and then fire at you with their gun, meaning you'll have to dodge the bullets from afar as you make your way back to them. As for the actual fight, Supreme will have one of Giganto's QTEs, except much more difficult. When you go in to attack the head, Supreme will try to bite at you. If you get caught in this, like Giganto, Supreme will try to crush you under their jaws, but if you escape, Supreme will fire a laser at you, requiring you to push it back or get launched way across the island. After the first phase, Supreme will then summon their wings, except this time they'll actually use them. The fight then becomes much more like Wyvern's battle, forcing you to chase after Supreme as you fly above the entire island. Supreme will fire lasers at you from their back turrets repeatedly. In order to catch up to them, you'll have to attack the individual turrets and chain your way up to the back turrets. The only way to end this part of the fight is to take out both turrets, but they can take a major beating and will blast you back pretty quickly. Once you've done it though, Sonic then grabs Supreme with all his might and then throws him back onto the island. Supreme crashes through Master King's tower in the process, because fuck that guy. This isn't the end of the fight though. Supreme then gets up and Sonic gets caught in one massive tornado of cyber corruption. They then fire lasers at you from all angles as you get trapped in a cage of beams that you must avoid. While avoiding all the light shots, you have to wait for Supreme to fire exactly one dark shot. Once they do, you can parry it back into them, launching them out of the tornado and allowing you to attack. You have to be careful here though, because if they hit you a single time, you get flung back into the tornado and have to go through the process all over again. And judging by the ring timer, you do not want to do this part over again. After this, the final phase of the fight begins. Supreme flies out above the ocean, and you have to follow them. As you're making your way to them though, they summon several guardians, like Asira, Strider, Fortress, and Master Ninja to slow you down. Luckily, in your super form, you can take all of these threats down in one hit, but if you do manage to get hit by them, it can slow you down quite a bit. They fire turrets relentlessly at you. You then have to destroy their main 8 turrets once more before side-looping them yourself. Once Supreme is caught in your tornado, the final QTE occurs. You fly up into the sky, farther and farther, as Supreme continues firing at you with their gun. Any shot here is detrimental, so you have to make sure to press the buttons at the right time to dodge out of the way. Eventually, the pressure of the tornado makes Supreme drop their gun, and from 500 feet up, Sonic then begins to stomp down at Supreme. More and more golden light surrounds his body until he becomes like a meteor crashing down to Earth. He then hits Supreme with the force of a god, and they fall into the ocean. Now, the final boss, the moment you've been waiting for. The end. After the Supreme fight, corruption begins leaking out of their body and coming out of the ocean, bringing a lot of water with it. The final cutscene proceeds as normal, but without Eggman this time, and we'll get into why soon. The end also has rings around it now from the water brought up from the ocean. These rings will act as shields for the end, making it much harder for the player to do damage. The first part of the battle against the end will proceed mostly as normal, except there would be 2 more attacks to make it a bit more difficult. In addition to light and dark shots, the end could also produce custom purple shots that neither dark nor light could penetrate, meaning the player would have to dodge them at all costs. In addition to purple shots, the end could also make black holes that would suck the player in, meaning they would also have to avoid them in order to live. Once that part of the fight is done, we get into the true final boss. Inside of the end, whispering can be heard. Indecipherable noises and inhuman emotions are produced from it. Suddenly, all of the purple in the end vanishes, turning it completely red. The moon then shatters, as black lightning and white tendrils burst from it, and it enters panic mode. Now we get into the gameplay of Cyber Sonic himself. It would be pretty much identical to Super Sonic, but with a much different flair. You would also have much stronger attacks, dealing damage in the thousands instead of the hundreds, because bigger numbers make the ape-brain happier. The fight would be much different from the traditional Sonic Frontiers boss fights. The end wouldn't have a health bar, instead it would have a counter above it. The end is constantly charging up a planet-killing laser through the entire fight. Every 30 seconds it will try to fire it, and it's up to you to make sure that doesn't happen. You have to constantly deal as much damage to the end as possible. If you're able to bring the damage counter to 0 before it fires, then its attack will be stopped, and it will start charging another. You'll have to constantly be dodging lightning, light shots, and tendrils from the end, as well as hell lasers and so many other things in order to get close enough to do damage. Luckily, Sage will also be helping with Supreme, but you'll have to do most of the work yourself, as each time the end starts charging an attack, the damage requirement to prevent it gets higher. After a while, it starts to feel hopeless, with even Sage admitting that there might be no point. While you're able to prevent the end from attacking, the actual harm you're doing is null. Just as Sage is about to give up, a massive cyberspace portal opens back on Earth. Both Sonic and Sage look down on it. Even the end stops for a second to see what's happening. Then, out of the cyberspace portal, emerges the Death Egg. Okay, I know this part sounds a little bit crazy, but hear me out. We know Eggman will end up playing some role in the final boss because of the leaked script. And what better way to fill that role than to actually use the Death Egg? We can see it in some of the cyberspace levels, so we know a model for it exists. Come on, Sega, just let me have this. The Death Egg then takes a weight off Sonic and Sage's responsibility. Eggman will constantly hit the end with barrages of attacks, meaning it won't be able to charge up any planet-killing lasers, and Sonic and Sage can focus on destroying it. Sonic then releases the full power of his cyber armor, and the third phase of the fight begins. The end is now focusing all of its effort on you. Now it will create waves and waves of electricity, forming them into webs that you have to weave through in order to attack it, as well as firing multiple hell lasers to force you away. Regardless, you press on. Once you get the end to half health, all of the rock on its body breaks off, revealing its soft, white, almost gum-like inner core. The end is enraged by this, and it hits the Death Egg with a hell laser. Eggman is then forced to retreat into cyberspace, leaving the rest of the battle up to Sonic and Sage. This time, the end will attack with all of its power, even warping the space around you into indistinguishable forms just by its sheer presence. For the final attack, Sonic reveals the full power of cyberspace. The pilots of the Titans, as well as Master King, Sonic's friends, and even Eggman appear behind him. They all condense into large, watery wings behind his body. The end fires 3 hell lasers at Sonic, but he boosts out of the way of each of them. He continues forward as a rocket of cyberspace and chaos energy emerge out of his body, until he's just a burst of light traveling across the sky. Sonic flies through the end as all of the energy courses through his body. It then shrieks out and pulses for a moment, before evaporating into nothing but sulfur. Then, Eggman and Sage return home. Sonic is reunited with his friends. Before they leave though, Master King pulls Sonic aside. He congratulates him on his victory against the end, but warns him of the consequences of going all out. He could become corrupted himself, and in all honesty, even though Sonic did a good job, he wasn't sure if the end was really gone. Sonic promises that no matter what happens to him, if that ugly rock ever shows its face again, he'll work twice as hard to defeat it. Or in this case, 6 times as hard, because holy shit, it looks like Sonic Team is expanding a lot after the success of Sonic Frontiers.